Hello everybody, this is Professor Ramirez, and I would like to situate Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe within the context of what I call Americanist literature. And what I'm going to talk about today is an excerpt from my book, British Representations of Latin America. This was published by the University Press of Florida. And in this book, I have a chapter which is dedicated to what I call Americanist literature. So the book has an introduction about British representations of Latin America. It has a survey of Americanist literature. And then I go on to offer close readings of various writers such as Robert Schomburg, Joseph Conrad, Arthur Conan Doyle, Malcolm Lowry, and Graham Greene. So the chapter that we're going to focus on, which is most important for our understanding of Robinson Crusoe, is the survey of Americanist literature. And I'm only going to focus on the 1700s, the 18th century. So the 18th century gave rise to a rich array of texts that broadened the scope of the literary conversation about Latin America. We see in the 1600s a growing awareness of the ethical considerations involved in exploration and colonization. For Pagden, it was colonization which forced the savage, quote, and the barbarian, quote, and with them the problem of the intelligibility of other worlds, fully upon the European consciousness. In Europe, the consequence of this was the gradual evolution of a powerful self-effacing myth that in the early part of the 18th century came to be known as the bon sauvage, or noble savage. Along with the awareness of the European self and the New World other, we can discern in literature of the 18th century what Pratt calls a planetary consciousness, an awareness of the roundness of the earth, and an intrigue with continents and their interiors. According to Pratt, European knowledge-making apparatuses had been construing the planet above all in navigational terms. These terms gave rise to two totalizing planetary projects. One was circumnavigation, a double deed that consists of sailing around the world, then writing an account of it. The second planetary project, equally dependent on ink and paper, was the mapping of the world's coastlines, a collective task that was still underway in the 18th century. And of course, the 18th century is when Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe, but known to be completable. Like the rise of interior exploration, the systematic surface mapping of the globe correlates with an expanding search for commercially exploitable resources, markets, and lands to colonize, just as navigational mapping is linked with the search for trade routes. With the expansion of British trade in South America came the redrawing of old maps to reflect new routes and new enterprises. Green's remarks in support of the new chart of North and South America and James Culnet's account of voyage to the South Atlantic and Round Cape are fairly typical. Green's remarks fits into the growing body of travelogues and cartographical arguments about the Americas. Meanwhile, Culnet's account of the whaling industry helps to bridge the gap between advertisement and survival literature. A voyage to the South Atlantic and Round Cape encourages British business in Latin America, despite the hardships Culnet endured with his ships, equipment, cargo, and personnel in the face of storms, disease, and piracy. Again, what is important is not a list of texts about Americanist literature, but rather a comparative analysis of publications. In such a comparison, I hope to explain the impulse toward British expansion in Latin America on the one hand, and the impulse to be critical of such enterprises on the other. The attraction to Latin America was both economic and scientific. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and the anonymously published Proposal for Humbling Spain are arguments for a British presence in, respectively, the Caribbean and Argentina. Correspondingly, Samuel Johnson's thoughts on the late transactions respecting the Falkland Islands and Helen Maria Williams's Peru, a poem in 6 cantos, are both critical of European involvement and colonization of the Americas. So let's begin with a fresh look at Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which can be read, as J. Paul Hunter points out, as a novel about the role of Providence or as a survival narrative. Along with these two ways of reading the story, we can consider Defoe's work as a kind of advertisement for the mercantile and industrious spirit in the Americas. After abandoning his home in England, Crusoe learns the ins and outs of commerce by accumulating English products and introducing them to markets where they were otherwise scarce. Crusoe enjoys his newfound wealth, observing that, my goods being all English manufactures, such as cloth, stuffs, baize, and things particularly valuable and desirable in the country, I found means to sell them to a very great advantage, so that I might say I have more than 4 times the value of my first cargo. The seed has been planted. Crusoe understands how trade and investment work, and Defoe will return to this plot line at the end of the novel. But for most of the narrative, Crusoe is stranded on an island in the Caribbean and probably off the coast of Venezuela, in the same troubled waters that Sir Walter Raleigh traversed. To survive, Crusoe methodically assumes his role as a farmer, carpenter, potter, accountant, homesteader, and military strategist, and we could also add governor to that. When Friday arrives on the otherwise deserted island, Crusoe steers him away from his heathen ways by reading him passages from the Bible, adding missionary work to the growing list of Crusoe's duties in the New World. Many years pass, and Spanish sailors founder in the same treacherous patch of sea that killed Crusoe's fellow shipmates, and this time the mishap affords Crusoe the opportunity of naming himself, as I suggested, governor. Likewise, when the English mutineers land, Crusoe metes out sentences as the island's highest authority. Though this survivalist theme is strong and perhaps dominating, it relies on thematic elements such as commerce, the defeat of the Spanish, and adaptation to exotic foreign soil. And these are hallmarks, I would say, of Americanist discourse. Crusoe's prosperity returns at the end of the novel when, although he has been lost to civilization for 28 years, he finds his investments have matured. Not content with this profit alone, Crusoe sets out abroad again in his middle age, this time outfitting the Spanish and English colonists on his island with ammunition, seeds, and settlers, including women. Defoe does not lose track of the mercantile spirit in constructing his plot. His hero's success in the Americas lay in the many options available to Crusoe as a middle-class entrepreneur. He has since become an archetype for his moderation, rationality, and resourcefulness. So I think that will wrap up the discussion of Robinson Crusoe within an Americanist context. What you need to know is that English writers were writing about the Americas in the 16th century, the 17th century, and the 18th century. And Robinson Crusoe was published in 1719, although the setting is in the 1650s and 1660s. And again, I've pointed out some of the interests that the British had in Latin America, and especially capitalizing on trade routes and also plundering Spanish ports for their gold and loot.